And I'm now switching to English and passing the word to Jonathan Fink to do further introductions of our wonderful guest here.
So absolutely honoured and delighted today to welcome Volodymyr Yermolenko. Hopefully I've pronounced that reasonably correctly. He is president of PEN Ukraine, the Writers' Union, and chief editor of Ukraine World. He's one of Ukraine's leading cultural and intellectual figures, a philosopher, essayist, translator, doctor of political studies, candidate of philosophical sciences, and senior lecturer at the Kyiv-Mohyla Academy. It is, of course, a great privilege to be here in conversation tonight, and especially in Kyiv.
Thank you. I'm very, very honored to be here too.
Let's kick off with a question, because I'm in Kyiv for the first time. I've been to Lviv once before, so this is 2 trips to Ukraine now. But I really get a much more intense sense here of why Russia's attacking. This is the center of Ukraine, and of course it predates the Muscovite Empire. In a way, it seems to me it's a fight for origin stories, and from the Russia's point of view, a fight to obliterate an origin story which they would rather didn't exist. Is that simplistic, or is there some truth in that impression?
Well, there is obviously this element of fight for the origin, but I do think that the question, do you hear me? The question is, what values will dominate in this land? And I think the Ukrainian part of the story, the self-story of Ukrainians, it's probably banal to say that it is a story of freedom, but I define it as a story of freedom in despite. I don't know if we can say it in English like that. For me, this is the sense of the word voля, for example, which is very important for Ukrainians, because in this region it's very difficult to have freedom protected. In Europe, in Western Europe, it's much easier. You have castles, you have lots of stones. Out of these stones, you build castles. And when you want to have freedom, because freedom was not born in the 20th century. Freedom, the idea of freedom was born very, very long time ago. You can speak about the feudal freedom of the Middle Ages, when barons and counts and the aristocracy wanted to defend their freedom, and then they were build castles, and then they were building some kind of a state, and then they were protecting the rights before the king, and then you have Magna Carta out of that, etc. In Ukraine, there was the same story in those precise years in the Middle Ages, but the problem is, due to the geography primarily, due to some other things, this space is much more fluid. It's much more open to migrations. It's much more open to the demographical changes. And therefore, it's much more difficult here to have freedom with roots. And freedom with roots, like trees with roots, like the forest of freedom. You need to protect it with institutions. The problem of this space is that institutions were always erased by one power, then another power. And what Russians were doing when they were starting to build the empire in the 15th, 16th century, they were starting by erasing the memory and erasing the institution. We rarely talk about how important for the Russian political project there is to erase this very gesture of erasing and amnesia and really saying there was nothing here. This is an empty space. So Ukrainians are trying to fight against that. Whether we will succeed or not, well, the history of the whole region and maybe of the whole planet depends on that, because it's a question whether you can assert freedom despite the whole, tradition of the whole centuries of unfreedom, and despite this imperial wish to erase it once again.
I have a quick follow-up question there, and this may be true, this may not, but someone said there was a conscious effort to destroy medieval documents that attested to this long and complex period of history. Again, talking to your idea of erasure, was this a conscious process, or something that just emerged from, say, Civil War, Revolution, Second World War, or a conscious process to erase Ukraine's medieval and post-medieval past?
Look, you I might not even refer to our authors. I can refer to your authors. I can refer to the British authors. I was recently reading a book by one British author who was called, I think, Edward Clarke, and he has it's early 19th century, and he's describing his travels to Russia, and he's describing Crimea, and it's remarkably interesting how he describes Chersones. So the Chersones is now the symbolic city for Russians, because Putin is saying, okay, we come from the Kyiv state. He doesn't call it Kyiv state, but he believes that the Prince Volodymyr, who was ruling in Kyiv, who was ruling here, is actually his predecessor. He's calling him Vladimir, he's building status in Moscow, and he thinks that the key starting point of the Russian history is when Prince Volodymyr from Kyiv, came to Chersones and was baptized into Christianity and brought Christianity to these lands. So the problem is that now, if you were in Crimea, if you were in Sevastopol, where you have these ruins of Chersones, you understand that these are ruins, that there is practically nothing there. So, and the news we are getting from this region now is that this destruction of these monuments continues. But then you go and read this travelogue in the early 19th century, and you understand that this British guy came to Crimea, and he was saying, look, there were still ruins of a quiet and a big city. There were still gates. There were still doors in the building. And then the Russian Empire was just destroying it, taking marble out of that, building some, huts instead of that. So, and then you ask a question, okay, if you consider this a symbolic place for you, then why are you destroying it? Then we have, of course, lots of our Ukrainian authors. For example, our famous poet, Taras Shevchenko, who has this very striking image of Russians coming and destroying what he was calling Mohyla. And what he was calling Mohylas, graves, was actually these kurgans, these big places where lots of, let's say, prehistoric or pre-Christian cultures were burying their dead. We are talking about Scythians, we are talking about others. And for him, it was a very traumatic experience, as if the Russians were going and erasing these traces. So I do think that this is an important element to think about, because Europe was built upon the idea of legacy. So we built something, the Germanic tribes built something, the Celtic tribes built something, but you take the legacy from the Greek world, you take the aesthetics from the Greek world, you take the Roman law from the Roman Empire, you take the language partially from the Roman Empire. How many Latin words do you have in English, for example, right? Let's think about it. I think in the Russian conception of history is totally different through centuries. It's a rather conception that we're raising the cultures. We do not build upon them. We're raising, and we are saying we came to the empty space.
A follow-up question. Can storytelling and stories shape such legacy when there are no institutions, when there are literally no physical evidence of previous times?
Yes, I do think that stories is an important thing, because again, what do you do when you don't have you have a much lesser number of cities, for example. The city is a good proto image of institution, because it's kind of made out of stone. We have lesser number of cities in Ukraine, but we do have cities, and I think one of the identities of Ukraine is the identity of cities. You came to Lviv, and then you came to Kyiv, and I came back to Kharkiv yesterday, and you have Dnipro, and you have Odessa, and you have Kherson, and you have Kropivnitsky, and you have Vinnytsia, and you have Ivano-Frankivsk, and you have Donetsk, and you have Luhansk, and you have Simferopol, and you have... These are very, very different types of cities. So the the way how people in Dnipro think, or the way how people in Kharkiv think and how they act, is very, very different from the way how people in Kyiv think and act, and Lviv, etc. And this is this richness of Ukrainian city culture, which I think comes back to medieval times, comes back to the Greek times. So the idea of polis is very, very important. But when you don't have cities, for example, in this big step that we have, the part of our history, and at the same time, right now, archaeology tells us that this very old culture that we are calling Tripilian culture was famous for producing big settlements. So we have this story of cities in Ukraine. The problem is that you don't necessarily have these, traces in stone, like in Greece or Rome, etc. Then you have invent something. Then you have tell the stories, and this is a very important thing: how we are telling the stories about our past, how we're telling the stories about the time that we actually don't have much written evidence about, because it's our history as well. This archaeology of culture is very interesting.
And if you have an empire that has that policy or mechanic of erasure, but at the same time expansion, which we know the Russian Empire is constantly expanding, and it has trouble delivering value from the territories that it expands into, but expands nonetheless. If you're going to define yourself in that space, on the edge of that, then you need something quite strong. I would almost call it nationalism. And of course, Russia uses the concept of nationalism in a very negative sense, and it has some negative connotations, parts in the West as well. But is there a real difference, and we discussed this in a previous conversation, is there a real difference between cultural nationalism and colonial nationalism, which sometimes kind of get confused together?
I don't think there is Russian nationalism in the kind of a classical sense of the term. I mean, there is Russian. Why? Because I don't think there is a Russian nation. Because a nation is a group of people that really has a certain connection, for example, with the locality, with the land, with something else. I do think that in Russia we have another syndrome, is that they built an empire before they built a nation, and then they kind of identified the nation with the empire, and then you ask a question: okay, but what is the real connection between, let's say, Slavic peoples and Ugrophin peoples and Mongolic peoples? And I think one of the fear of the Russians about Ukrainians is that if they cannot persuade Ukrainians that Ukrainians are Russians, how they will persuade Buryats that Buryats are Russians. And therefore, if you don't have this political space, the common political space, common values, the only thing, and you don't even have the common religion, because you have Buddhism, you have Islam, not only Christianity. The only thing that connects your people is language. And therefore, this is something that people in Western Europe really find it hard to understand. Why Ukrainians are so kind of so protective, so thinking deeply about the language. Why we consider that the Russian language is a threat? Because we don't consider Russian language is just one element in the plurality. We consider Russian language as an instrument to destroy plurality, and that's a big difference. It's a kind of the analogy between Western empires like British Empire or Belgian Empire or French Empire and the Russian Empire. There are many analogies, but there are differences, because when the British colonizer was coming to let's say India or Africa, the message was, you will never become the same as me. I'm higher than you because I have a different race. And this was this hierarchy of racism, etc. When the Russians are coming to the colonized people, their message is, you will never become different than me. You will always become the same. You will always be the same as me. So it's not the idea of difference and hierarchy and racism, which is a tool of domination, but the tool of domination is the idea of sameness. And how you ensure the idea of sameness? Again, erasing the memory, erasing the identity through language. The Russians are saying, if you forget your language, if you forget your culture, it's everything will be fine. You will become Russian. You will even rule Russia. We'll let you rule. I mean, we'll let you Ukrainians rule. We'll let you the Georgians rule. Whatever. The problem is that they are no longer Ukrainians and no longer Georgians and no longer whatever else. So I do think that this is important thing to understand, and therefore, for example, there is kind of this mindset. When I'm saying Russian, I don't really mean that it will be always like that. I'm just particularly meaning this certain political structure which was born, let's say, in 15th, 16th century. Because just imagine they started their statehood in about late 15th, early 16th century, and by the early 17th century, they were already reaching the Pacific. Can you imagine this drive of expansion? And they are afraid of losing that. And therefore, they are thinking that if they do not expand, they will narrow down, they will shrink. And therefore, they start these colonial wars over and over again. It's not only Ukraine, it's Syria, it's Georgia, and they are seriously thinking about attacking Europe. Europe is absolutely unprotected right now, especially if we see this turmoil with Trump and everything.
I wanted to add that, just a personal experience as well. You know, I can travel north of Oxford half an hour, 45 minutes, and you've got a totally different accent. And in some ways, you know, diversity of cultures as well. And yet you get on a train from Moscow, travel 5 days and 5 nights, and the accent hardly alters at all. And that attests to that rapidity of expansion.
I'll just continue with the follow-up questions, so which will drag us a little bit in a different direction. So, in one of your recent Facebook posts, I'm a fan, you touched on the idea of fairness, that some people always have it harder, and you discuss it as a sort of a thing worth thinking about sometimes. And one of the challenges that we face in conveying reality of war to those who are outside, especially who have not been through any of the sirens, through any of the explosions, is that they simply don't understand us. They don't understand what it is. And I was wondering how, in your opinion, again, from your experience as a writer, as a journalist, as the editor-in-chief in Ukraine World, how do we bridge that gap? And what approaches can actually help to connect people experiencing war, whether in Ukraine or elsewhere, in Syria, in Georgia, with those who have never lived through it?
Very difficult question, because basically what you're asking is how to translate experience, and experience is untranslatable. So if you, for example, didn't live through the bombings, if you didn't live through these explosions, if you didn't lose a close friend or a family member, it's very difficult to explain how to do it, but how to feel it. But basically, humanity understood it very long time ago, and therefore I always saying that, look, read Aristotle to understand what is going on. Aristotle was saying, what is the purpose of drama? Like, why the hell you would go and see Aeschylus and Euripides and everything? And he was saying, okay, the purpose of drama is that to invite you to feel emotions that you don't necessarily feel in your daily life. We will give you the emotions on stage. You will go through them. And by going through the emotions that you do not necessarily feel, you kind of enlarge yourself. You expand to others. You become more empathic. And I think this is one of the major roles of culture. Culture is, okay, it's also about identity, it's about asking who you are, but it's also about, making these bridges between you and other people in a situation when experience is untranslatable. So culture is an impossible endeavor to translate the untranslatable. And, it's a very long problem of humanity and very long history how you do it. So I do think that the major element is through culture. I think that Ukrainians sometimes, and when I say Ukrainians, I say myself, and I felt this, so when I first went abroad, to Paris, for example, I felt myself like to being in a matrix. Like, people are happy here, people are okay. So you talk to people, and for example, you are telling about your experience, and people say, "Oh, how interesting." So they kind of using words that shock you, because it's not interesting that you're on the brink of losing life, or that you lost your friend or whatever. But that's not their fault. And it's our task to find new ways to translate this experience, because it's like opening up a book written in a language that you don't know. And I always use this metaphor, emotions and understanding. It's about this ABC. It's about learning the alphabet. It's about learning the basics. And of course, you need a person which is open to that, which is willing to understand you, but you also need to make an effort, because this person is not necessarily in your position. And I think it's a long task, and this is what culture does.
Can I just follow up on this question? So, on the one hand, we're talking about translating these experiences, but on the other hand, war is still very deeply personal. So, the way I'm going through it is not the same as you or anyone else here is going through it. And one of the ways that is often present, again, in media is trying to explain things through the lens of, say, if I'm talking to Afghan person, through their lens. But again, since it's very personal, our traumas, they can actually clash. And sometimes it actually works the opposite way around. So it's harder for me to understand them because our experience of war is different. So the question I'm asking is, should we actually keep drawing these connections? Again, like trying to explain terms, concepts, experiences, or wars, or is it more productive to speak about every single case separate and within its own terms and concepts?
That's a very good question. And I think there can be no straight answer. So if we comparing it very mechanically, it's bad, because each war is probably different. I haven't seen many wars, but in Ukraine there are lots of war reporters who have seen different wars and who can compare. Again, can they really compare? Because a war reporter always comes as an outsider, and he or she can always leave. And that's always kind of it's always a tricky thing to talk to a journalist that comes, or to be a journalist yourself, because life always gives us these situations where you, on the one hand, on this side of the barrier, and tomorrow you will be on another side. So I have both the experience of talking to reporters who kind of seemed like a little bit of war tourists, but I was also kind of felt like a war tourist when I was coming to the frontline cities and talking to soldiers or whatever. So it's always this very tricky thing. But I do think that from my experience, I can feel much more understanding from people who went through very, very harsh experience than from people who are not, and this is normal. I do think that we still need to talk a lot about Syria and Ukraine together, for example, and this is a time now to do that. I've just made a podcast with Raja Abdusalam, who has been working on war crimes in Syria, but now is part of the Reckoning project, who is working on crimes in Ukraine. And one of the things why we should do that is that, for example, if we have one perpetrator who is similar, like in this case Russia, you can really see the patterns. And one of the things that, for example, he said, which was kind of I intuitively understood, of course, going into this war, understanding this war, but is that, look, Russians are using violence not for military purposes, but rather for power purposes. Like, they're using violence to show that they are the boss. And this is violence when they're bombarding cities, and this is violence when they're shooting at civilian cars. This is violence when they're doing torture. And if you understand that the violence for them is not a tool to even to exterminate the enemy, but a tool to assert the very sadistic domination, you kind of understand what kind of power they have in mind, because they don't have the conception of power as authority, for example. Like, I have power because, I don't know, people just, listen to me, or they think that I'm wise or whatever. No, their conception of power is violence. The connection between these two is very, very important. And therefore, when you understand it, you understand differently how they will react and what to do with them, because in their mindset, the cruel person, and I also read it on Facebook 1 week ago, the cruel person, how you say it in English, I know the French word, le bourreau, the executioner, right? The person who cuts your head. So while in the Western European, Central European cultures, Eastern European, this executioner is always kind of a person who should be placed on the borders of the society, because he's not clean, and he's always dealing with death, and he lives outside of the city. He probably doesn't have wife or kids, whatever, because he's dealing with death. You better go away from him. So in the Russian society, you see that this executioner, the very violent figure, is in the center of the society, is the one who you consider to be a sovereign. And therefore, Putin knows that, and therefore he understands that the more people he will be able to kill, even his own people, the more people will kind of see at him, look at him with awe.
So the Oprechnik is a kind of hero, not someone on the outside. Something you said a minute ago, now I hadn't scripted this question, but I think it could be interesting. They say that generals always fight the last war. But journalists, to an extent, do they sort of cover an accumulation of their other wars? So when they come somewhere like Ukraine, they come with a hybrid set of previous experiences and narratives which they try to overlay, which may be completely inappropriate. Do you think that's true? And how would you go about countering it? Is it only individual stories grounded in reality that can reset that?
Look, journalists are different, so we cannot say about journalists in general. I have lots of good friends journalists. When I say this kind of a critical remarks, my friends journalists should also understand that I'm not talking about all the journalists. I think the journalists need to be very careful with people, very careful about this experience that people have, very careful about the country, because sometimes some people come with their set of ideas and their set of ideologies, and kind of a certain indoctrinated, like people saying, okay, nationalism is always bad. Nationalism is not always bad. Nationalism is bad when it is offensive, when it is imperialist, when it is violent, when nationalism is defensive, like when you have a big enemy and you need to consolidate your society. Nationalism is not bad. It's another tool to assert equality, because nationalism was born from the idea that, well, the rich and the poor, the women and the men, the kids and the adults are all part of the same organism. So initially, nationalism in the early 19th century was primarily anti-tyrannical, republican, and there is still very, very big potential in that. But of course, there are problems with nationalism when it becomes bad, when it becomes radical, etc. And we need to understand what we are dealing with. Are we dealing with the phenomenon, or we are dealing with excess of this phenomenon?
I actually want to return to the point about executioners and about violence and those aspects. So I'm not sure if it's even appropriate to ask Ukrainians this question, because I get asked that a lot and it's quite annoying, but I'd like to hear your opinion about that. So what Russia is doing in Ukraine is basically the act of genocide. So trying to erase the culture, trying to erase people based on their national identity. And a lot of people now are asking about reconciliation, about, okay, so if the war ends, how do we live together in a world where the executioner, the one who commits this genocide, is actually next to us? So And then it also opens the door for the question of should we include Russians or liberal Russians or Russians of any sort in any discussions on whatsoever, on any topic. So what is your take on that? Should we, how can we actually approach this question? And returning to my question about connections and analogies, would it even be appropriate to talk about, because this is also coming up quite often, about Germany after World War II and how everybody like became friends and now it's like a progressive country and so on and so on. So is it appropriate to talk about this? Is it the time to talk about this? And what is your take in general on this question?
So I think that the problem of Russia is that it does not have an alternative vision of its own polity, like what Russia really means. And do they have the historical roots to rethink what Russia is? They do. But these historical roots are very, very deep. And I mean primarily these republics of Novgorod and Pskov, but they were exterminated very long time ago. Since then, there was no ideology, there was no intellectual movement that would conceptualize Russia in a different non-imperial terms. That's the difference with Germany, for example. In Germany, you have Enlightenment. In Germany, you have Immanuel Kant. In Germany, you have lots of people who would say that no, the key task of the state is not the hierarchy and domination. The key task of the state is I don't know, the well-being of individuals or whatever else. The same we can say about France, of course about Britain, about Poland, about Italy, about many, many other countries. So there is this gap in the Russian intellectual tradition, political tradition. The problem is that they even did not use the opportunity to kind of develop their liberalism after the Bolshevik coup d'etat. Because what happened with these key intellectuals of Russia, which were put onto the ship, the so-called philosopher's ship in 1922, if I'm not mistaken, and just deported. People like Berdyaev and others. What they must have been doing, they should have been saying, okay, the whole history of this Russian imperialism is a mistake. We are now having this Bolshevism as a kind of a repetition of this mistake in different terms, not only mistake but a crime. And we should now think in terms of individual rights, freedoms, liberal values, etc. They failed to do that. The only emigre from the Russian Empire who was doing that was Isaiah Berlin. And Isaiah Berlin, you say? How you say it? Isaiah Berlin. And not people like Berdyaev or Struve or else. Instead, all these people were developing the ideas of Russian idea, the book by Berdyaev, Ruskaya Idea, or something like that. So they replaced the idea of Marxism. They were all Marxists, by the way. They replaced the idea of Marxism, like the big proletariat, blah, 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 with this idea of Russian idea, the idea of Russian state. And this is kind of set of ideas is now used by Putin. Ivan Ilyin, who is very known by Putin, admires him, comes from this generation. So I do think that, and I do think that I'm always saying with this to our Western partners who are kind of trying to help the Russian liberals, the Russian immigration, etc. And I understand them. They have empathy and they think that helping Ukrainians, helping Belarusians emigrate, helping Russians emigrate is the same story. For Ukrainians, of course, it's not the same story. And the same that Belarus and Russia is also not the same story. But what I'm saying to them is, look, it's not about bad Putin and good Russian society. It's not about, there is a problem of tyranny of one person and oligarchy, and when you remove it, everything will be fine. It's a problem, much a deeper problem of the history and tradition of the Russian vision of the world and the Russian vision of politics. And why you need to understand that? Because basically you should be preparing that Russia is attacking Europe. And especially now when Trump is attacking Europe. And I'm really thinking that Europe will be increasingly a kind of a bigger Ukraine in a position that Ukraine already went through. And of course, there is no understanding in Europe about that in most countries. But even if you just set emotions aside and you understand like what is going on, Europe is militarily absolutely unprepared. If Russia says, okay, if Russia wins in Ukraine, of course, we are sure that it will not win in Ukraine. But that's another story. And answering your question, how we think about reconciliation, there will be no reconciliation. Ukrainians will be taken as slaves to the Russian army, and then this big army will go to Poland and Baltic states and Romania and Bulgaria and etc. That's something that happened a long time ago, and that is repeating. But there can be another scenario when Russia says, okay, but NATO is inexistent, America will not protect Europe, we are struck in Ukraine, why don't we hit the Baltic states? Why don't we hit Finland? They are much less prepared, they have much weaker army for the moment. They can do that. And unfortunately, there is a very little number of people in Western Europe who are talking about this.
I think that idea of never again versus yes we can is not particularly understood well enough. This is again maybe a pointless thought.
It's not yes we can. It's we can repeat.
Можно повторить.
That's different.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. This may seem a sort of pointless thought experiment, but it struck me that if we had the media environment of the 1970s and 80s, when I started watching the news, and I remember the coverage of Yugoslavia and the outrage and almost the unanimity of views that we had to go and do something to prevent genocide, despite the fact that these are people who have very little at that point that we knew about. If we had that media environment, pre-social media environment, it seems to me that there'd be a very different Western response to the war in Ukraine. But we inhabit a social media digital landscape of fragmented realities which become highly partisan and which certain actors can manipulate to their advantage. Do you think that's a useful way of thinking? And how do we communicate the Ukrainian reality in this fragmented, fractured and divided informational ecosystem?
Well, I think the very important question is on the receiver side. And how our audience is thinking. And I think we really need to be very frank with the audience and say, look, ask yourself whom you really trust and why you trust. So I think this is a question that, for example, I'm teaching my students and always, where does this piece of information come from? What is the genesis of this? Like, it's like thinking about the hygiene of products that you're consuming. So why I appreciate, Jonathan, that you are here, because I do think that in our virtual world, presence is one of the key virtues. So therefore, people need to understand that. Therefore, for example, if people ask me about the Palestine, about Gaza, I refrain from answering this question. I have my own set of opinions, but I do think that I'm not authorized to answer this question because I have never been there. And I've never been there. I haven't talked to these people. I can have my opinions, but I do think that my opinions will not have authority and should not have authority. But we have all this discourse about Ukraine, coming from people that have never been to Ukraine, that have come here for 2 days, that nobody knows somebody from Ukraine, and basically who are talking out of their ignorance. And therefore, I do think that this conversation with the audience is like, why you think that what Tucker Carlson is saying about Ukraine, why you think it is true, why you think it has any value of thinking about, because if you're not present, then it's obvious that you will do a lot of mistakes. And the same about us. I mean, there are so many people who have some judgments about about some regions of Ukraine without really capacity to go there and to be there. So presence is very important virtue, and I think this is when we're talking about Ukraine, I think the key check about trust, the trust check should be about the presence. I mean, how long have you been here? How long have you been with Ukrainian soldiers if you have judgments about what is happening on the front line? Have you visited the front line? Have you understand what a landscape the Ukrainian front line is, etc., etc.?
But is presence enough? Because we also, something we discuss quite a lot is this notion of epistemic injustice, meaning that even if people come to Ukraine, even if people talk to Ukrainians, there's always this thing that, oh, you're not authorized to talk on behalf of yourself because you're prejudiced, non-objective and stuff. So while it's been 3 years into the full-scale war, journalists who come to Ukraine, their texts are still edited by the editors who are sitting somewhere. So is presence enough, or are there other factors that contribute to this notion of trust and to the quality of information we get out of local contexts?
Look, it's a long process. You cannot have it once. I understand that, for example, since the start of the full-scale invasion, I've been to Kharkiv 20 times. And still I'm very, very reluctant to judge about Kharkiv, because there are people living in Kharkiv. Ask them, and I can give you contacts. I can just express some words of admiration, but always find the person who is the closest to the events, who is closest to the senses. And I think we need to be careful about this, because even people who are coming to Ukraine, sometimes you feel, sometimes you understand that, well, still you talk to them so many hours, but still there are some gaps that they're saying, okay, but something that shocks you. But we Ukrainians should also be very demanding about ourselves. Sometimes I have the impression that the only thing we can talk about is Ukraine and our experience. I do think that we need to go and to make these bridges and to understand that other experience is also worth listening to. So therefore, for example, we at Ukraine World, we are trying to make Ukraine understood in the world, but also make the world understood in Ukraine. And this is also, we need to start thinking in a non-provincial way, in a much global way.
And I think on the channel for 3 years, I've been trying to understand more about how Ukraine differs from Russia in a whole variety of ways. One of those seems to me that it's more solution-oriented, it's more forward-looking, future-looking, and whereas it values what's in the past, it's not a kind of toxic nostalgia. The trouble is, as democratic politics and consensus breaks down in the US, in Britain and other places, people turn to the politics of grievance and a weaponized nostalgia, weaponized memory kind of politics, which is much more easy to manipulate. Do you see those patterns, and do you think Ukraine has something of a solution that we could benefit from?
It's definitely the solution can be kind of a much more frank conversation about the future, because the future gives different emotions. It gives always hope, but it gives always fear. Of course, you can kind of replace future with the past, and this is what is happening. And this is understandable, because the future is so much unpredictable. And we kind of start being dependent on decisions of people we don't know and will never meet. And I do think that the problem is that the Western world looks into the future without hope. And this kind of a fear is starting dominating the Western reflection about itself. Fear, and also kind of a self-masochism about the past, like we were all bad. The truth is that the West was not always bad and not always the worst. I mean, it's also kind of a reverse imperialism. When you said in the 19th century, we are the best of everybody, now you're saying we are the worst of everybody, No, other people could have been worse than you, and still you can talk a lot about Western imperialism and colonialism, but the Western culture also developed the remedies against that, and it has always been this confrontation between pro and contras, right? So I do think that there is a problem of the faith in itself in the West. My friends in the West are telling me that the West doesn't exist. I think that that's also a symptom of this problem. Because, of course, everybody is very fragmented. I'm very fragmented. You are very schizophrenic, I'm sure, so Jonathan, and I am very schizophrenic. All of us are having different sets of individualities. Remember, we can behave in one way, and then we are so sorry about the way how we behave when we are in emotions, etc. There are different sets of individualities that we are working with ourselves, but doesn't mean that I'm saying that I do not exist or Jonathan do not exist or no. Of course, we are very fragmented in ourselves, and our societies are very fragmented, but still there is something that unites them, and I do think this is important to stress this. I don't know how to bring this faith back. Well, I think that the only way to bring the faith back is to fight. And therefore, when I come to Germany, when I last came to Germany, I was saying in the conference about freedom and liberalism, freedom is not a warm bath. Frankly speaking, freedom, we have no guarantee that freedom exists. Freedom is a task. It comes sometimes. You can only feel it when you fight for it, because we are determined in so many ways. Freedom is not a given, is not a fact that we are born with, is a very something that on the horizon, and you probably at some point will feel that you're free. And the challenges are coming for Europe, and the way how you will respond to these challenges, I think you went through a very, very mostly well, I think, with COVID, but COVID, you don't see this anyway. It's too microscopical, and it doesn't really demand from you. It's demand from you kind of a self-restriction. It demands certain level of asceticism. It demands certain level of management, but not the idea of fight. Now, increasingly, you will probably need to open this emotion of fight against the enemy. Whether you will succeed or not, I don't know. But it's only through fight that you regain the faith in yourself.
But what do you mean by fight? Could you explain a little bit more on what is included there?
Fight is a situation when you understand that you can lose something, and that the opponent that takes this something from you is stronger than yourself. I always saying that look who were called the heroes in the Greek age. The Greek, like Heracles and Achilles and all this stuff, Odysseus. The heroes were those who, in particular Heracles, was those who were fighting it against something that is bigger than themselves and stronger than them. From this comes the concept of glory, which was very important for the ancient world and for the medieval world, but then we lost it in the modern world. Glory is something that survives even after your death, because you went to challenge something and you probably lost, even lost your life, but you were not afraid of doing that. Kind of European civilization became very bourgeois from the 18th and 19th century. And I do think, and then, of course, it regained these values during the First World War. Then they were transformed sometimes in a very nasty way in the Second World War. And then Europe said, okay, let's remove everything from that. Let's talk not about heroes, but about the victims. Because the war is about victims, we should commemorate the victims. And it's true, you should commemorate the victims. commemorate the victims. And that's another extreme that the Russian ideology went, because the Russian ideology was only about heroes and Великая Отечественная война, etc. Of course, we need to combine that. We need to talk both about victims, but also about heroes, not in these pathetic terms like hero sometimes used. Again, my definition of this word is that it's somebody who is challenging something that is stronger than yourself. And while going on this confrontation with what is stronger than yourself, you enter this emotion of glory.
It sounds almost like the sort of struggle of the body against, infections, that you cannot have vibrant democracy unless you also have its nemesis, which is the absence of it. Somewhere you can look and say, well, that's the void. That's what happens when this is absent. And only that way you can understand the mechanics of it and keep reinvigorating them.
Well, we will see. Probably these tyrannical things, authoritarian things that are coming right now in Europe, it might be the death of Europe, and then we will enter the world of tyrannies and new imperialisms, and believe me, it will be very bad. Or it will be kind of this injection, this Pfizer dose against this COVID of totalitarianism, of new autocracy, and maybe it will help your societies to get better. We don't know. We don't know because the 21st century can be a century of new decolonization, de-imperialization. The Russian Empire will fall and the Chinese Empire will not be able to take over. But it can be also a century of re-imperialization. I'm always repeating that the danger is there, and we can be in the world where basically on the ruins of empires there are not republics and democracies but other empires. And I'm sorry to say that, but this is the law of history. This happened much more often than the democratization, but it doesn't mean that the battle is over.
It sounds like it's almost a very difficult path. It's either Orwell and a boot stamping on a human face forever in 1984, or you're the world of Aldous Huxley and a kind of dictatorship of consumerism. But we need to find a path between those two alternative tyrannies.
Yeah, the consumerism, look, the danger of consumerism is that it gives you fake freedom. It gives you an illusion of freedom, like... What is freedom? I can watch a Netflix movie, or I can buy a new phone, I can buy a new car. Is that freedom? When other than that, you are basically prohibited from saying something that you think, or doing something that you believe in. Is it? And the problem. This is an argument of Anne Applebaum in her latest book, Autocracies Incorporated, and I think this is a very good argument. We have a podcast with her about that on Ukraine World. That she kind of, while Hannah Arendt beautifully made the distinction between totalitarianism and the classical tyrannies, I don't want to go into that. I think Anne is doing like the next step of differentiating between these consumer autocracies, which kind of gives you an illusion of freedom, which doesn't really control you in that way like Stalinism was controlling you, or fascism or Nazism. It kind of gives you a fake freedom, but then gives very, 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 very big restrictions on that. And primarily, which tells you exactly who is the boss and that you will suffer if you do not do certain things. Yeah, I think it's a very dangerous world.
Returning to your previous point, I was wondering if you're talking about fight with something that is stronger than you, can we just then say that there's a risk of democracies simply becoming sort of the negation of empire?
Look, the concept of empire is a difficult one. You can say you can have republics which are also empires, right? So America is probably a republic which is an empire. Republic inside, but empire outside. I mean, medieval Venice was probably an example of that. And that's a very there is a question what EU is, for example, right? Because my definition of empire is something that has a clear center but doesn't have borders because it wants to expand. while republic is something that has clear-cut borders but doesn't have a center because it's plural. But then what is European Union? It's kind of a combination of both because it certainly doesn't have a clear center. We still don't have a phone number to call the European Union. So Kissinger's wish is still not fulfilled. But I'm sure that Europe will only survive when it continues to expand. But Europe is expanding in values, not through military terms. It becomes attractive, and I do think that what we had in 2010, all these, revolutions, what is called Arab Spring, which is not Arab Spring, but which is kind of a cycle of revolutions, which is a kind of people do not look at it through the whole perspective because there is Georgia, Ukraine, Moldova, Kyrgyzstan, then there is, Lebanon, Syria, and there is Algeria and Tunisia. And this is all part of the same process. I think this is the values of these individual rights, community rights, which go beyond Europe, which not necessarily produce good things at this moment, which probably are defeated. And right now we see all these revolutions defeated. And Ukraine is one of the only who is fighting with the military invasion because of that. But this is what Europe still don't understand, that it continues to expand. The values are expanding, despite the fact that Europe doesn't want it really. And so it's a kind of a tricky thing. I'm not saying that empire is bad, the republic is good. You can have different sets of things. But what is really bad is those empires which are Russian Empire, which are empires both within tyrannies and empires outside. By which I mean that there is no horizontality. There is no idea that you can have horizontal relations between people, between cities, it's only verticality. You are either the slave of your master or you're a master and you have slaves. And this is the only sets of relations that you have.
In fact, everybody is a slave, surely, in that hierarchical system, because there's.
I'm always saying that that's an intuition. I was quoting you, Edward Clarke. Go to the 19th century, read lots of things. I'm always saying when people ask me what is the best book about Putin, I'm saying Astorf de Custine, Russia in 1839 is the best book about Putin.
Yes.
It's a French aristocrat who came to Russia during the Nicholas I and who is described something that you will recognize today. It's the same like what is the best book about America. I'm saying it's Tocqueville, also mid-19th century. So sometimes things don't change. And what Custine described, it's a very beautiful formula, is that even the highest aristocrat in Russia, with relation to the Tsar, is like the lowest slave. I mean, we have the same story today. When people are thinking, okay, but what Russian oligarchs will do? There are no Russian oligarchs, because oligarch is somebody who has his property more or less protected, mostly by corruption or by a grip to power. No property of Russian so-called oligarchs is protected because Putin is owner of everything. He can take your property anytime he wants. And this is what happened a long time ago during Ivan Grozny or whatever. We need to understand these deep roots,
My favorite quote from that, he went to an imperial ball and he described the nobility in St. Petersburg coming in their fine gowns, dropping pearls and vermin onto the floor. It's quite a cruel book, but yeah, definitely worth reading. I think this last very quick question before we go to the Q&A.
So this is like addressing the elephant in the room, in a sense. Something that we could not just meet today, because it influences the work of half of the people probably present in this room and who will be watching us online. So we talk a lot about representation, about power, and people we don't know whose decisions influence us. So there is a decision that's influenced Ukrainian NGO sector just in the last couple of days with the suspension of funding for 90 days following the Trump's decision to do sort of audit of where the money is going. And I'm wondering, what's your take on that? what it means in the global set of things. And if we have decisions of that sort, what does it mean for the general balance of power in the world?
And also, I wanted to add Georgia in there as well. Could this tip the balance towards Georgia Dream and really damage civic society that is resisting?
Well, I cannot forecast the future. It's definitely that this unpredictability and the ability to adapt, which Ukrainians are very strong at. So I think it's currently one of our key virtues, this ability to adapt, adaptability. About American aid, I do have the impression that it's like punishing the victim that is already bleeding. It's like you come to a wounded person, and instead of helping this wounded person, you just take a purse and take the clothes and whatever. So it's definitely bad things. But I'm seeing how Ukrainian media, how Ukrainian civil society organizations are reacting to that. Well, adaptability is, I think, one of the key virtues. But Americans need to understand, and Europeans need to understand, that all this assistance which is coming here is basically driven by values. It's driven by a certain understanding what is good and what is bad. And basically, the key understanding is that you actually need to empower those people, those groups, those citizens who are probably less empowered. And I think this is one of the values of what we are calling democracy, is not living in a society where the strongest takes it all, where the power believes to the strongest. Now, unfortunately, yes, with Trump, we see that this idea that strength is the key argument, and that it's basically coming back to the social Darwinism that was ruling in the late 19th century and early 20th century. And basically we know to what it leads, to what results it might lead. Because if you are in the logic of social Darwinism, meaning that kind of, it's what I called zoopolitics, Russian zoopolitics in 2014. If you are in this logic that human society is about battle of beasts and animals and showing who is the strongest, then it will necessarily end with very, very big conflicts and all around the world, because basically you will find those big beasts who are fighting between each other. And of course this worries me very much.
So we've had basically two questions. One of them was about allies and how to make allies and convey meanings especially in the UK audiences. And, well, I suppose any English-speaking audience, I would kind of expand this. And the second question was, well, I think we also partly answered it. Yeah, that question was about the hatred of Russians towards Ukrainians and whether it is the result of the Russian propaganda or its roots have some deeper meaning lying in history and certain events that happened in the past.
So Russians truly believe that without Ukraine, they are kind of they're headless. Well, Greeks have this word akephalos, so they are a body without a head. Which is not true, because I do think that Russia can perfectly exist without Ukraine, and I don't agree with this famous phrase by Brzezinski that without Ukraine Russia will not be an empire. I think Russia can continue to be an empire without Ukraine, without Belarus, and all this stuff, because I mean, its essence is the empire. The fact that they are so much thinking about Ukraine and so much afraid of losing Ukraine and therefore willing to do utmost violence to keep it, and by the way, in a very sadistic terms and very sadistic even in the sexual meaning, because it's remarkable how often they describe Russian-Ukrainian relations in the sexual terms.
Peter Moporantsev talks.
Yeah.
About
So
that as well.
it's sexual sadism primarily. It actually shows how weak they are, how non-confident they are in their own idea, and therefore, well, by placing their own origins in another country, well, that's truly problematic, because, okay, but if Russia did not start in Kyiv in 10th century, but it started in 15th century or 16th century, which is probably true, what's the problem with that? What's really the America as a state started even later. So there is a certain I do think that they feel really like a body without a head, and it shows their weakness, and therefore, of course, this hatred, because they think that Ukrainians are really stealing their history and stealing their identity. Well, that's their problem, and I do think that Ukrainians have another vision about this, and this vision is not ethnic. Let me repeat it. It's about the way how you organize society. So, if you look, even it's remarkable how some Western anarchists are talking about this very ancient proto-cities in Ukraine, these Tripilian settlements, and saying, "Wow, this is a truly anarchic polity, because there is no there is no signs of administrative buildings there, so there is no signs that somebody's somebody's building is better than others." Well, this is the way how Ukrainians were thinking about themselves all this through history. It's the way how medieval Rus was functioning. It's the way how the Cossack states was functioning. It's the way how Ukrainian intellectuals was trying to understand what is going on here. It's the way how Drahomanov was thinking about Ukraine, how Kostomarov was thinking about Ukraine. It's not necessarily good, this kind of egalitarian anarchism, and therefore we have another trend of thinkers who are saying, no, we need verticality, we need kind of a strong power. Because obviously if you have only this egalitarian and democratic and anarchic society, well, at a certain moment you will face problems, because of course at a certain moment you need verticality, you need strong power. So it's always a balance between horizontal and vertical. But Russian polity is definitely very, very vertical. It's only vertical. And there is a conception of society that basically you don't need the relations between humans, you don't need horizontal relations, because I'm addressing my neighbor only through somebody who is higher, only through the boss. And this is deeply, Ukrainians feel it very, very badly. Ukrainians are not accustomed to it. We have another sets of values, and I think this fight is about that primarily. We now call it democracy. I don't really like this term. I think this term is misleading. I prefer the word republic, meaning that this is a common thing. We govern it together. Sometimes we decide who is the boss tonight or for the next 4 years. But it's certainly very hostile and very, very alien to the way how the Russian statehood thought about itself since the 15th and 16th century. And therefore, they really feel that freedom is a virus that can destroy them. I think this is the major feeling about that, and therefore they try to destroy this virus here.
We're coming towards the end. Let's take a question from the audience. I think we've got, I don't know, Volodymir's got just a little more time. Who is absolutely desperate to ask a question?
It's been absolutely, genuinely fascinating. Jonathan's touched on this already, beat me to it to a degree. There are so many differences between Russian and Ukrainian nationalism, it seems to me, but do I know this? I'm not Ukrainian or Russian. But is there anything that can be said about Ukraine's sense of nationalism being a forward-looking one that looks to the future, and Russia's nationalism looks to the past? Russia is like a tree stump, and I'd be interested if this metaphor at all works. Russia is like a tree stump that only looks down to its dark roots that once held up what they think was a great tree. Is it that Ukraine is a young tree that, although obviously older in history, arguably, as we've heard, is a young tree that takes nutrients from its roots to grow and flourish in new places, upwards and into open space. The only way Russia knows to expand is by spreading its roots over more land. Ukraine wants to spread its branches and foliage, that there's this sense of going towards this unknown future, but in a sense, utilising adaptability. You think of the tech industry could be a good example of that there's this forward-looking sense that embraces a really, really positive nationalism rather than a backward-looking one. Does that make sense?
It's very beautiful and poetic, but I will challenge it a little bit. I don't think that we are totally immune from this, looking into the deep roots of the past, and I don't see any problem with looking deep into the past. I mean, we all have ancestors, we all have legacy. If society is not without heritage and without legacy, it's a bad society, and therefore we are talking about this amnesia. So the Russians are afraid of these, deep roots. And look at the way how Ukrainian culture and literature restarted itself, if I may use this term, in the 19th century. Of course, through folklore, through collecting songs, through making this image of Kobzar, who is very interestingly connected with the way how, for example, Scots were thinking about their minstrels, or I don't know, English. Did you do that as well? So there is a connection with British Romanticism, and therefore one of the most favorite writer for Ukrainian romantics in the 19th century was Walter Scott. And this connection between the figure of Kobzar and the figure of minstrel is very interesting. Because why? Because what these figures are doing is literature which is not written, which is transmitted through voice and through singing, and which doesn't necessarily has authors. So it goes very, very deep in history, very deep into the past. And therefore, of course, every nationalism has a certain, heritage myth or Genesis myth. It's normal. Ukrainians and Russians, the difference is with attitude to the past, what we are looking into in the past. So the Russians, what they are looking in the past is very clear. They want a new imperial power to repeat itself. Therefore, this phrase "we can repeat," for them, it's a very important phrase. Look at how Putin is, why he's referring to history. He's saying, "Okay, I want to be again a Peter the First." We don't use in Ukraine Peter the Great, by the way. And I want to be Catherine II. Well, he probably wants to be Catherine II. So, and he directs his geopolitics with these ideas, because why they went into Ukraine in the 2014 and why they went to the Black Sea coast, precisely to revive what Catherine II did, because Catherine II just brought the Russian Empire to the Black Sea coast and to the Sea of Azov. And I'm always saying this to you, to Europeans. Look, the next step is defeat Peter I. What Peter I did, he brought the Russian Empire to the Baltic Sea. And therefore, be very careful when you think about what will happen in Finland, in Baltic states, etc. When Ukrainians are thinking about the past, they think about the past not as an El Dorado that you can repeat, but they think about the past as hell. So probably, or purgatory. So probably in this hell or purgatory there are good things, that definitely our ancestors who give us force, who give us strength. But basically their major glory is to be in this hell and purgatory and survive and not surrender. So it's a kind of a different attitude towards the past, right? I'm always joking that the last phrase you can hear about from a Ukrainian is let's make Ukraine great again, I mean, again is a very bad word for us. We don't want something to be again. Therefore, we are trying to look for something else. We don't want the repetition of history, because history was a kind of a purgatory for us, and we want something nicer. And it doesn't necessarily that we will have this something nicer in the future, but at least we kind of try to hope it will. While for Russians, it's clear that there is this paradise. This paradise is, of course, full of violence, but for them it's a paradise. And they want to come back to 1945, to Catherine II, to Peter I, and then they invent something that they annex the past. Before annexing territories, you annex the time, as said my friend Alexander Sushko very, very many years ago.
So, I think what I meant to say is that Ukraine seems to me to be excited about what it could be,
of course,
rather than Russia being excited about what it was.
Of course.
Which is not to ignore what Ukraine has been previously, but you use that to as a springboard to the future.
But don't underestimate the Russian theory of the future. I mean, because if you think that Russia is only about the past, you make yourself weaker. Because Russians do have a theory about the future. And the theory about the future is that the West will decline. And this is a very important thing, because the problem of this Russian theory of the future is that basically it's a Chinese future. You know, because the response to the West decline is only China response. China provides you with a true alternative, like what the world will look like. It will certainly be a world of big family, so-called family. The Chinese conception of the world, as far as I understand it, is not the Western conception of the world. In the West, a very important concept of the politics is that politics is when you leave the family, when family is no longer there, when the tribe is no longer there. For Aristotle, what is polis? Polis is something that when people meet who are not relatives, right? And the same for John Locke for civil society. When John Locke thinks about civil society is something that exists before the state. And it's when people who are not family members, who are not relatives, meet and interact in some way. Chinese version of the world, in Confucian version of the world, is like all of us somehow connected by family ties, and you need to respect the big father. And therefore, they will try to build it where there is a big father, and when we are kind of a big little children of this big father, the billions and billions of children. And Russians are somehow in between because they lost they actually lost the family values. Their society is very fragmented, but their theory about the future is that the West will decline, and there is a big competition who is declining power, because Ukrainians think that Russia is declining power. In the first months of the war, the consensus in the West was that, okay, Russia cannot capture Kyiv, it is declining power. I think it's very dangerous. Russia has not proved itself as declining power yet, at least militarily, and therefore it is a danger for all of us. And we don't know who is actually the declining power, Russia or the West. The fight is here for that. So I would not underestimate this Russian conception of the future.
Thank you. Great question and incredible answer. Have we got time for one more? Have you got a few minutes? Let's get one more in.
Hi, thank you for all you have said, but I want to ask you more personal question. Actually, I have two, but I think the personal one is more important. So I want to ask you about Ukrainians who are living in Russia and who admires Russia. For example, I have relatives in Russia. My uncle was born in Luhansk region, and now he lives near one of the big city in Russia, and he believes in everything. The other example is Sergei Polunin, who was born in Cherson, and he is a world-famous dancer, and he was the famous dancer in the Royal Ballet in the UK, and he now has a lot of tattoo of Putin on his body. So what attracts them? Why do they buy this other type of values instead of going to the more individualistic free world. But why do they do this?
Because they want to be great.
But you said that all are slaves and only one Tsar is the Tsar.
That's precisely. If you want to be great. By the way, I'm very worried about America and this great again. Because if you want really to be great, if you're using, I'm not referring to Great Britain, no, it's okay. But if you really want, if you stress the word great, the only way how you can build this greatness is by smallness. Can I say smallness? No?
Yes, I think
smallness of its elements. So the only way for a Russian citizen to understand that you have a meaning, your existence have a meaning, is through this connection with this greatness. Therefore, I'm always saying that the true virus of this war is the very idea of great Russia. It's not Putin. It's not. It's the very mindset that says, "What is Russia? Russia is great." You know. So I'm sure that there is a different sense of the word great, because in English you can. I remember this communication company about Great Britain that holidays are great and cities are great. So you don't have it in the Russian language because the word great does not mean this. Because veliki, you cannot say your holidays were veliki, right? you cannot say it. You cannot say how you feel great. You cannot say как у тебя дела? Великий, right? You cannot say this. So there is kind of this difference of nuances. Why? Because in English language, the word great was kind of going to a very human element, I think. And we are just using this word. In Russia, it didn't happen. In Russia, the word great, veliki, means that, but basically that you build something great in geography, great in power, etc. And this is one thing. The second thing, why Ukrainians, assimilate, because Russians were very smart in proposing the level, the kind of the tool of assimilation, and therefore I was referring to this, that the tool of the Russian imperialism is not the idea of racism, but the idea of assimilation. So the tool of domination is not the idea of difference, but the idea of sameness, and the vehicle of this idea of sameness is language. Therefore, for Ukrainians who were taught in Russian language and went to Russia, they say, "Okay, you are Russian. Come on, let's do that." So I think and therefore this is a fight that nobody really understands, except for some people that really are deep into Ukrainian history, or some other our neighbors who understand it. That this fight for identity, Ukrainian fight for identity, is an anti-imperial fight, because the vehicle of imperialism is language, and therefore this fight for Ukrainian language is so important, right? I think that the primarily thing is that you're a small guy and you want to feel great, be great.
One more. I think
Yes.
if anyone's got one more, yes, please. Gentleman
Hello
at the
to
back.
everyone. Volodymyr, it was very interesting to hear your thoughts. My name is Lyubov Velichko. I'm an investigative journalist based in Kyiv, and I'm a researcher of Russian disinformation. So when you were saying about sexualized image of Ukraine, you give me an idea. I want to share it with you and to hear your feedback. Like how to stop Russians dreaming about Ukraine in sexual way, if we can say this. So let's imagine that Russia is a man and Ukraine is a beautiful, beautiful woman who he admires and dreaming about. And I think why oligarchs, when they have a super beautiful woman, often divorce, is because that woman has a horrible character. Horrible. And Ukrainians, in that sense, are real anarchists with horrible character. That is why our national sport is, I don't know how to translate it into English, but srach. Other words,
It's the srach.
Yes, and that is why none of our politician parties or politicians after 6 months on the power can be as favored as in a good position on the view of the people who were voting for them, no matter what they do, because we just feel that we all are like kings. And that is why for many, many centuries we have this words like, if you have 3 Ukrainians, 2 of them will be hetmans, like kings. So,
if you have 2 Ukrainians, you will have 3 hetmans.
Oh, yes, sorry for that.
Much more nuanced.
So I think we just need to give the idea to Russians that Ukrainians, they have such a horrible character that you didn't even realize how horrible it is. So if you will get that beautiful woman, your life will be a disaster. Like, it's better not to keep in touch with her. You just can observe from far distance from that girl to live your vertical life as you live right now. What do you think?
Look, I would not put in the gender terms. I think it's misleading to say who is the man, who is the woman. I think that Ukraine is a society where there are men, there are women, there are all kinds of people, and that's a kind of also very colonial discourse. You know, you're a woman, and then there is kind of this politicization of the gender, that woman is only a person who does this and does that, and who can be only wife, etc. I think it's very dangerous and very misleading. It's wrong. I understand your point that you're basically saying that, okay, let's give Russia an idea that there is this anarchism in Ukraine that will destroy your empire. Well, we tried that many times, and it was not good for Russians, but it was certainly not good for us. I do think that instead of that, we kind of we should develop a certain fear. We should develop in Russia a certain fear of Ukrainians as a very strong opponent, partner that will not be in subordinate position, because this logic is kind of, okay, you are in subordinate position, you just spoil something. I'm not comfortable with that. But coming back to the sexuality, the thing is, I think it's very deep, because while using these metaphors of sadism and rape, etc., they are not only sexualizing politics and power and violence. They're not only sexualizing violence, but they are bringing the element of violence into sexuality. You know what I mean? And by bringing element of violence into sexuality, they actually bring the element of violence into love. And that's the most perverted thing that they are doing. Because they say love does not exist. Love is only about violence. Love is only about power. And if we're talking about love, you know, it will only be the only pleasure that I can get from love affair, the Russian kind of soldier things, is through violence. And I do think that this is one of the most horrible things that they develop in themselves, because it's a kind of it's a feeling. I'm thinking about this since very long time, and I was writing articles about that, like about Sadoputinism and everything like that. What I meant by Sadoputinism is an idea that imagine you're living in a society when you cannot get pleasure. By pleasure, I mean the normal human pleasure of life, pleasure of love, pleasure of food, pleasure of breathing the air, pleasure of physical existence, pleasure of reading, pleasure of singing music. And while you're unable to get pleasure, the only thing that makes you kind of a substitute of pleasure is suffering of others. If you are not getting pleasure yourself, you're only getting pleasure when you understand that others feel worse than you. When you cannot feel better, then the only way how you feel better is when you understand that others feel worse. And I do think that in this sadism. And I'm not thinking that this is a particular Russian phenomenon. I'm sure that it is very deep in human nature. This idea that, okay, I cannot get pleasure, at least I will make somebody feel worse than myself. But if we look at the way how they work with space, for example, how they come and build ugly houses and destroy the spaces and erase memories, etc. This is this syndrome. Again, I don't think that this is particularly Russian, but I think that Russian political culture made it really the vehicle of their political life. So I'm really worried about this, and I do think we need to think very carefully about this.
This is the very, very last one, and it's going to be a very quick one, Simon.
Yeah, as a woman, thank you for stepping away from the gender metaphor.
Thank you. So you're obviously well versed in the use of words. You understand people's psyches a great deal here. You know, very, very much rooted in Ukrainian society and history. You've mentioned polis a couple of times. What sort of messaging do you think can be changed to get more of the hoi polloi, the people of the polis, to become hoplites in Ukraine?
To become?
Hoplites, so to join the army. What messaging do you think can be changed to convince more people to put on a uniform?
Well, look, I don't know the answer, frankly. I cannot give you the recipe. I do think that there is a... I understand what can happen if we do not go into this, more solidary approach to the army and to the warfare, because that means that we have broken justice or broken fairness. I don't know how to do. I was writing about this yesterday. When people basically think that, because what makes people unhappy about society is when you give more than you take, right? The breaking of this social exchange. And this is what drives populism. I hate the word populism. I think when we're thinking about populism, we just close our eyes on deep problems which are in this society, in any society, and in Western societies as well. It's always the breaking of this mechanism of exchange. When you give more than you take, and when somebody else takes more than he or she gives. And that's obviously a problem with Ukraine, with oligarchy, and et cetera, et cetera. So I'm very afraid that we kind of are in this mode of society right now, when soldiers really feeling, and I know what I'm talking about because we travel to the front line like very, very often, and we have very close connections with some soldiers. And I think it's dangerous. I don't know how to solve it, basically, but I do think that there is a problem of communication from the state, from the government, which really doesn't give this message, and which is afraid of giving this message that basically defending Ukraine is a question of solidarity, and therefore you all are going to go through, military exercise and prepare yourself for the army. Because the message from the government is that there are Cossacks, good guys, ZSU, trust in them, and everything will be fine. And I think we are going in a deep crisis about that. And if we do not go through this, if we do not, build this much more rotational and solidary army, we will have very, very fragmented society. And this is a very big danger. We will have a society, and we're already having it, of very big mistrust and even hatred between different stratas of people who have different relations to the war. Because the war is a very strange thing. On the one hand, it gives you common experience. On the other hand, it gives you very, very personal experience, and which cannot be translatable, right? And the more we have this situation when experience of some group of people is totally different than experience of our other group of people, we'll have big divisions in this society. Yeah. So I don't know. I don't know whether we can help it by messaging. I think there should be other things to do except for messaging. There should be change in the recruitment process. Should be changes into the way how you basically prepare citizens, because I mean it's not normal that you get this thing from the military unit, how you call it, povistka, and then you're basically afraid of being dragged into the unknown. I think this is the thing that frightens a lot of people, not only in the risk of being wounded or death, but this unknown. Where will I go? Who will be my comrades, etc., etc. So messaging is not enough. I think there should be more wiser government policy, but I don't have a feeling that the government now thinks about that. I have this feeling that we are kind of going to the kind of a caste society, I'm sorry to say that, which is kind of going to this old Cossack times when you have a warrior class and you have, let's say, a bourgeois class and you have a peasants class. And if you go to that, then forget about nationalism in the good sense of the term, because there will be no solidary collective understanding what nation is, because it will only be case of warriors and the warriors will be saying to the bourgeois and peasants and whatever, okay, but you're not really people who invested their efforts and we despise you. And this kind of the feeling of this disgust, it can happen, and it's probably happening, and we all need to do something with this.
That's an incredibly important place to end, I think, and it echoes some of the conversations that I've actually had this week, and echoes of that. People who are in uniform, and yeah, it's understandable but terrifying. I want to say a huge thank you for you to giving up so much of your time and extraordinary insights to the audience here in the room, but also to the online audience who are going to be watching this in a couple of days' time. And on their behalf, a huge, huge thank you for today and everything you do.
Yeah, and I'd like to thank Jonathan, my colleague. I'd like to thank Volodymyr for being with us today, to thank everybody who managed to come, to wait for a little bit as we start a little bit later. And also, once again, huge thanks to Isar Yednanya, who are hosting us today in their wonderful office, to Kirilo, who's sitting somewhere there, you don't see him, but who's helping us technically, to Nine's department, and Veronika, who's somewhere there, for arranging this whole event, to Vlad from the Ukrainians, our great friends who are also helping us technically and hosting us so kindly. And thank you once again for being here, and hope to see or hear you soon.
Thank you.
And thank you, Yaroslava, for all the logistics, which she hates doing, but did anyway.